Welcome to Wastewater 101, a series of videos designed for health department professionals engaged in wastewater surveillance work and interested in learning more about wastewater and what their utility partners do. This is part one. What is wastewater? I'm Anna Marotra, Director of the Wastewater Surveillance Program at the Water Environment Federation, or WEF. And I should note that development and production of this material was made possible through funding from the US CDC to WEF under Cooperative Agreement CK20-2003. And the content of this material is solely the responsibility of WEF and does not necessarily represent the official position of CDC. So wastewater is the water supply of the community after it has been used in a variety of applications and which now contains constituents that render it unsuitable for most uses without treatment. This definition comes from the book Wastewater Engineering, Treatment and Resource Recovery by Metcalf and Eddy, which is now part of AECOM and was published in 2014. Wastewater is known by other names, and its aliases include used water and sewage. In fact, there is a movement underway to embrace used water instead of wastewater, but that term hasn't become widely used yet. And as you'll see, even though wastewater is sometimes called sewage, it usually isn't just sewage, although it can contain sewage. So we started treating wastewater with biological treatment processes in this country more than 100 years ago, really to prevent the spread of human disease. And wastewater treatment, when done correctly, is quite good at protecting both human and ecological health. But the field has evolved, and now wastewater aspires to be so much more than just used water needing treatment before discharge into a receiving stream or river. Wastewater aspires now to be a source of energy through anaerobic digestion of biosolids, a source of information through wastewater-based disease surveillance, and a source of nutrients, mostly nitrogen and phosphorus. And of course, the clean water itself in wastewater can be reclaimed and reused. And you'll learn more about wastewater treatment, including energy and nutrient recovery, in part 3 of this series, and a little bit about water reuse in part 4. So what exactly is in wastewater? Well, there are many constituents in wastewater, and I like to think of them as being comprised of 4 elements. So the first, on the upper left-hand corner, is what we usually refer to as sewage, or more specifically, domestic sewage, or rather ironically, sanitary sewage. This is the used water from sinks, toilets, washing machines, dishwashers, tubs, showers, and similar fixtures in residential and institutional settings. The second constituent, shown in the upper right-hand corner, is stormwater, and this includes direct inflow into the sewer from rain, snow, snowmelt. It's basically anything that ends up in a storm drain during or after a storm event. The third constituent, shown in the bottom right-hand corner, is infiltration and inflow, and together these are called I&I, designated as a capital I / capital I. So infiltration, that first I, is groundwater that enters sewers through defective pipes, pipe joints, connections, or manhole walls and joints. And it tends to be pretty constant for a given system. Inflow, the second I, is stormwater that enters the sewers through roof leaders, also known as downspouts, yard drains, manhole covers, and storm drains. So I'm showing stormwater is a separate constituent of wastewater here. Really, technically, it is a type of inflow, but I like to call it out separately, and you'll see why in a minute. The fourth constituent of wastewater encompasses industrial discharges. So a collection system can have no industrial dischargers or many industrial dischargers. It just really depends. And your utility partner should have a good idea of who the industrial dischargers are in their system. And that's because industrial dischargers often have to get special permits from the utility to be able to send their flows into the sewer system. And those permits will have limits on them. You know, what's the maximum concentration of certain parameters that can be included in that industrial flow. And we're going to talk more about permit limits in part 4 of this series. And we're also going to talk more about the typical characteristics of each of these 4 constituents in wastewater in part 5 of the series. But that's really it. Domestic or sanitary sewage, stormwater, I&I, that's infiltration and inflow, and industrial flows. Now, all 4 of these will be present in what's called a combined system. A combined what, you might ask? Well, a combined system is one in which the domestic sewage, the I&I, and the industrial flows are conveyed in the same pipe network as the stormwater from storm drains. In this graphic here, which comes from the Milwaukee Metropolitan Sewerage District, you can see a schematic of a combined sewer network on the right-hand side. So this is where the domestic sewage and industrial flows plus that I&I are represented by the orange lines, and the stormwater, the direct inflow from stormwater drains, is represented by that teal blue line. And you can see they combine in the same pipe network. Well, the problem with combined systems is that they have to be able to manage high storm flows, right? Because all the rainwater, the snow melt, the snow is ending up in the same sewer as your sewage, or high flows during what we call wet weather events. Wastewater treatment plants aren't usually designed to treat the absolute peak flow that you'll see in a combined system during wet weather. That would be an inefficient, use of resources to construct a plant that is that large to treat the peak flows. So they become a choke point in the system during wet weather events. Treatment plants do. And they can cause flows to back up into the sewer network and then overflow through, you can think of them as pressure relief valves, or overflow structures into nearby rivers and lakes and streams and even the ocean. So this occurrence of an overflow from a combined system is called a combined sewer overflow. And you can see it in this blinking blue line shown on the slide. So yep, that's untreated sewage along with other things being discharged into a receiving water. Now, many utilities have worked very hard to reduce the frequency of combined sewer overflows, or CSOs. And most often, this is through building really big, deep tunnels to store peak wet weather flows. And that's what's shown on the schematic here. But peak flows during wet weather events are just going to get peakier during climate change. And so management of peak wet weather flows for utilities that have combined systems can be a huge expense. But not all sewer systems are combined. Many, especially ones in smaller and newer cities, are separate sewer systems. And that means that domestic sewage, industrial flows, and regular old I&I, not the inflow from storm drains, are conveyed in a separate pipe network to the treatment facility, as shown by the orange pipes in the left-hand diagram on this slide. The stormwater, which again can be rain, snow, snowmelt, is conveyed from storm drains through its own pipe network and then out into receiving waters. And these receiving waters can be streams, rivers, lakes, or even the ocean. Because stormwater doesn't contain the same high concentration of pathogens as sewage does, and routing stormwater away from the treatment plant doesn't lead to CSOs, this is an easier sort of collection system for a utility to manage. The constituents in wastewater reaching the treatment plant through a separate system then only include domestic or sanitary sewage, I&I, and industrial discharges. Because again, what was in the upper right-hand corner, the stormwater, has been routed now through a completely separate pipe network that is not conveyed to the treatment plant. And by the way, you may be able to tell if a city has separate sewers just by walking around and looking at the ground. Manhole covers in separate sewer systems will usually indicate whether they are providing access to the sanitary sewer, which is the one that actually has the sewage in it, plus the other stuff, or the storm sewer, which only contains the flows, again, rain, snow, snowmelt from the storm drains. By the way, there is a lot of talk of moving away from the use of the term manhole, and alternatives offered have included things like access ports and maintenance holes. But again, we haven't moved away from manhole yet, and WEF is sticking with manholes for now, but we'll certainly update the terminology as needed. So now that you know what the flow consists of, it's worth digging a little bit into flow patterns to treatment plants. Although this will be covered more in parts 4 and 5 in this series, understanding flow patterns will help you understand what you are getting in your wastewater surveillance sample. So what I'm showing here in the graph on the right is what's called a diurnal flow pattern from an actual treatment plant in eastern Massachusetts. And diurnal flow pattern is just a fancy way of saying daily flow pattern. This plant has what's called an average daily flow, or ADF, of 6 million gallons per day, or MGD. So ADF is just that. It's the average of all 24-hour flows at the plant over the course of a year, usually. And MGD is the most common flow unit used by wastewater plants in the US. Smaller plants will use gallons per day, or GPD, but unfortunately, we still feel the need to be different than the rest of the world, which uses cubic meters per day or megaliters per day to quantify flow to their plants. We still stick with MGD and sometimes GPD. But anyway, what the graph shows is the variation in flow in the blue line to the plant over a typical 24-hour period, with the x-axis units in hours starting at midnight or 0 hours. The y-axis shows the ratio of the flow at any point during the day, during the course of the day, to the overall average, denoted as 1 for the entire day. I'm also showing typical diurnal variations in concentrations, so that's mass per unit volume, for various water quality parameters in the dark red line. So these might be concentrations of biochemical oxygen demand, or BOD, total suspended solids, or TSS, total phosphorus, or TP, total nitrogen, TN, or other things that plants track for process control and sometimes permit compliance. This sort of variability in concentrations is also what we might expect the variability in gene copy concentrations for a given wastewater surveillance target to look like. Also on the graph, I'm showing the typical variation in parameter loads. So that is mass of that parameter per unit time, which is calculated by multiplying concentration of the parameter by the flow and then performing some unit conversions. So that's the green line. Loads are really important in wastewater treatment because that's what's used to size most treatment processes. And that's why these load curves end up on the diurnal pattern curve for flow and concentration. And just a note that the SARS-CoV-2 wastewater data on COVID Data Tracker are effectively loads because they are flow normalized concentrations and therefore have units of gene copies per day. It's actually gene copies per day per person, but it's not gene copies per unit volume. Anyway, you can see by looking at this why the 24-hour composite sample is thought to capture the most representative sort of state of wastewater during any given day at any given plant. If you were to grab a sample first thing in the morning, say at 7 a.m., then the concentration will be lower than the average concentration for the day overall. And it will also be lower than if you grabbed it at noon. So as I note here on the left-hand side, flow patterns are typically flatter at larger facilities. Weekday flow patterns are different than weekend flow patterns, and that's just because people aren't getting up and going to work usually on the weekend. And I would guess that pre-pandemic flow patterns are different than post-pandemic flow patterns. And industrial flows can change a facility's flow pattern. They can also be unpredictable, so they just need to be taken into account. And here is what flow to a treatment plant might look like over a few days, if those days include a storm event, or let's just call it a rain event. So the x-axis here is still showing time in hours, but now we're showing 4 days instead of 1 day like we were showing on the previous graph. And the y-axis is just any old units for flow that you want to imagine. In this case, the so-called dry weather flow that includes infiltration only, industrial discharges, and domestic sewage is shown in the dark red. This is the flow pattern we saw on the previous graph, but now just replicated over 4 days. We'll say these are 4 weekdays. And then the infiltration portion of that dark red graph is shown in green. And as I mentioned before, infiltration tends to be pretty consistent over time from one system to the next. There could be seasonality to the infiltration. In coastal areas, there can also be tidal influences on infiltration, but in general, it's pretty consistent. So a rain event comes along around hour 30 and right away inflow to the sewer. So that's both direct inflow if it's a combined system through those storm drain, but also the other sources of inflow we talked about, through manhole covers and the like, starts to increase this right away. Inflow will continue to increase until the end of the rain event, and then we'll have quite a bit of a long tail after the precipitation is over as that rain and water makes its way through the system. So the total flow that the plant will see is shown in blue, and the difference between the blue and the red lines you can think of as inflow. Now, as I mentioned, in combined systems, sometimes it's not possible to convey the total flow to the plant. So the plant might actually see something less than that peak. And the other thing to keep in mind is that peak will be much higher relative to the red line in combined systems than in separate systems. But again, understanding this whole concept will help you understand, what exactly are you getting in your wastewater surveillance sample? It's also worth mentioning septage. Septage is the stuff that comes from domestic septic, also called on-site systems, that's pumped out by a truck and conveyed to a local wastewater treatment plant. These trucks add the septage to the beginning of the treatment process. There's a septage receiving station at treatment plants, but the exact point depends on the plant. So it's helpful to understand how much septage a plant accepts and whether that septage is being added upstream or downstream of your wastewater surveillance sampling location. Septage then is nearly all domestic sewage. There can be some small amounts of indirect inflow and some infiltration too, but it really is mostly domestic or sanitary sewage. So just to recap the terminology, wastewater is the water supply of the community after it has been used in a variety of applications and which now contains constituents that render it unsuitable for most uses without treatment. Sewage is used water from sinks, toilets, clothes washing, showers, tubs, dishwashers in residential and institutional settings. It's also known as sanitary sewage or domestic sewage. And industrial wastewater is wastewater discharged from industrial facilities, the composition of which will depend on the type of industry. Infiltration is groundwater that enters sewers through defective pipes, pipe joints, connections, or manhole walls and joints. It's the first I in I&I. Inflow is stormwater that enters the sewer through roof leaders. Those are downspouts, yard drains, manhole covers, storm drains. It's the second I in I&I. Wet weather is the flow condition in a sewer during or immediately after precipitation, that's rain or snowmelt events. A separate sewer is a sewer system in which storm drain flows are routed to a different pipe network than the pipe network that conveys sewage, industrial discharges, and I&I. A combined sewer is a sewer system in which storm drains are routed to the same pipe network as the one that conveys sewage, industrial flows, and I&I. Septage is the contents of septic systems that are pumped out and hauled by specialized trucks and dumped at many wastewater treatment plants. Not all treatment plants accept septage, but many do, especially many smaller ones in rural areas, because there will be a lot of septic system users in the surrounding communities. MGD is million gallons per day. It's the typical unit for wastewater flow rate. The largest treatment plant in the US has a capacity of more than 1,000 MGD or 1 billion gallons per day. ADF is the average daily flow, the typical metric used to characterize how big a wastewater treatment plant is. It's calculated as the average of all 24-hour flows during a year. Diurnal is used to refer to the typical daily pattern of flow collected for treatment, with peak flow occurring around the middle of the day. So here are some questions you can ask your utility partners about the nature of their wastewater. Do you receive wastewater from a combined or a separate collection system? Are there major industries that discharge to your collection system? If so, how many and what types? Are there major institutions like universities, hospitals that discharge into your collection system? If so, how many and what type? How extensive is infiltration and inflow in your system? Does your facility accept septage? If so, where does the septage enter your treatment process? Is it before or after you collect the sample that you send to us for wastewater surveillance analysis? Is there anything else that would be helpful to know about the type of wastewater you receive at your treatment facility? This was part 1 of Wastewater 101. What is wastewater? Other parts in this series include part 2, how is wastewater collected? Part 3, how is wastewater treated? Part 4, where does treated water go? And related to that, what are permits all about? Part 5, how is water quality monitored? Part 6, who works in the wastewater sector? Thank you so much for your attention. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to visit nwbe.org or email us at nwbe@wef.org.